Here's an example of that brought things into a little bit of stark relief for us when we went out and we spoke to a number of our alumni groups. That was at the end of a talk, and you might do the same thing, and we may not be sure how to take this. At the end of the talk, normally you have a number of people. We saw Tim earlier. There was a crowd around him. Everybody wanted to talk to Tim. Now, when we would give a talk, there would be polite applause, and everybody would walk away. We knew we had taken a shower that day, and we thought that they had been engaged. And what happened was the discussions that took place later, typically there were drinks, etc., people would come up in small groups, and they would say, "Oh, we have it." I'll still finish the story. They would say, "This is a topic we can't talk about in our organization. Our organization is all about success. If we try and talk about failure, we're ostracized. It's not really something we can talk about." So that kind of brought it into stark relief. And now we can get on with the presentation. Is that right? Great.
We're on.
So if we take a look at what every organization is looking for, what all of you are doing that are leaders, entrepreneurs, members of teams, you're looking to drive growth. Right? Growth is the mantra. What does every publicly traded company CEO look for? We want to talk about growth. We want to talk about earnings. We want to talk about those elements. The other thing that they always talk about, that we always strive for, and we talk about here all the time, is innovation. And the third element that we look for, and the numbers on this when we say how many employees are this way, is do we have engaged team members? Do we have engaged employees in our organizations? Those are really, from our standpoint, three core elements that leaders want, organizations want, entrepreneurs want. How do we leverage failure to help drive that? And that's what we're going to be talking about here in the hour or so that we have. How do you then remember effectively? There's 4 steps. Number 1, it's the words that you use. It's how you think about talking about failure from the standpoint of, do we think about it as positive or negative outcomes, or do we think about it as failures? How do you kind of communicate those failures within your organizations? And consistent with the words, it's the questions you ask. It's what happened, why did it happen, how did it happen, before we say who screwed up and who do we need to fire. And then it's the stories you tell. And it's one of the reasons why we embed so many stories in our talk today, because the stories are what is memorable. And that includes, for example, this project didn't work out, but the person who was leading it then went on to lead the next project, which became the biggest hit in the company's history. So the stories that you tell that get embedded, and it's the relics that you have. Wouldn't it be great if you showed up at the Rocket Chemical Company and you saw WD1, WD2, WD3 to show how they've continued to remember that they weren't always successful. So those are 4 elements that we say are crucial for the remember state. So the thing we'll leave you with here today is to use failure. It is like gravity. It's everywhere. It will help you drive the growth you're seeking, the innovation that you and the market and your colleagues want, and it will help you drive that employee engagement that creates a better workplace and a better performing organization. Let's just do some really basic math, which says if you want to innovate, you have to do things differently. If you do things differently, you have to take risks. When you take risks, a certain % of those will fail. So if you were to follow A equals B, B equals C, etc., then you would say to drive greater innovation, which will then lead to that greater growth, certain parts of the organization, John referenced the different failure zones, need to embrace the willingness to have outcomes that are negative outcomes. The other thing that we didn't talk about specifically is that if you think about, if you leverage the language of science, where you say whether you have a hypothesis and you'll have a positive outcome or a negative outcome, in either instance, you will have greater knowledge, and that greater knowledge can then be put to work, and that can be put to work to drive those innovations we're talking about.
Have you researched any companies that undertook large-scale business transformation efforts? I was at a company where they tried that 3 times, spent a lot of money, and still failed. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to changing the paradigm on how companies operate on a broader scale, how do you either break down the modes of failure so that they could at least succeed, remember how they got there, and rebound from such a failure?
So one of the ways that we've looked at in general in organizations is this whole concept of failure zones. Because when you take a look at undergoing a major transformation, you're talking about reorganization, changing focus, things like that. We spoke with the former CEO of Charles Schwab, Dave Pottruck. And what he said was there were times when they were trying to drive massive change in their products because the market was requiring that, and they would enable and encourage failure. Whereas there were others in their transaction processing where they said, no, this is not an area where we have billions of dollars every day going through this that we can encourage or even allow failure. So the way that we've looked at that, and this is what we heard back from CEOs that have undertaken major change, is they compartmentalize those failure zones to encourage failure, or at least, if not encourage it, at least acknowledge it.